So Tina, I don't know if you want to say anything first. I have kind of an outline of things that I wanted to talk about today about the outage investigation process. But if you want to say anything to get us started, that's fine. Otherwise, I can jump right into it.
No, I think in the effort of the benefit of time, if you want to go ahead and dive in, I'm totally great with that.
Okay, great. Well, I have kind of an outline of things that I want to talk about, and then we can open it up for discussion. And I feel a little silly because I think most everyone on this call probably already knows a lot about what the outage investigation process looks like. But for the sake of the recording, I'll go ahead and go through it. And let me go ahead and share this. So I'm going to share the section of statute, or not statute, but commission rules as we go through it. But first, I want to start off with kind of a discussion of what the outage investigations are and what their purpose is. The commission staff is required by Rule 2143K to investigate basic emergency service outages that meet other criteria approved by the task force. And it says apparent basic emergency service outages, so we may not know at the outset of an investigation whether an outage really was a basic emergency service outage or not. If it looks like a basic emergency service outage and it meets the other criteria, then it gets an investigation. The criteria was established by the task force, and that's what the rules call for. So you see in this very first part of 2143K, it says meeting criteria established by the 911 Advisory Task Force. The task force did put together that list of criteria, which includes a number of different things which are listed on the outage investigation form, things like affecting multiple PSAPs, lasting longer than 4 hours in duration, any report of miscommunication or poor communication between the BESP and the PSAP during the outage, that sort of thing. So there's a list of criteria that can trigger an investigation if it appears that it was a basic emergency service outage first. So it's kind of a two-step criteria. The purpose of the investigation is to basically comes down to, and we'll get down to that when we get to the end of this section, to answer certain questions that the commission staff then has to include in their final report. Those criteria, those things that we're supposed to determine are: one, whether the outage was in fact a basic emergency service outage, whether the BESP handled the basic emergency service outage in a timely manner and with appropriate personnel, and that one's a difficult one to answer in a lot of cases. Determine whether the BESP has taken or committed to taking corrective action to prevent or mitigate a similar outage from occurring in the future. Note that it doesn't say that the BESP has to commit to taking action or take action to prevent or mitigate a similar outage in the future. We're just determining whether they have committed to doing those things. And document any non-compliance with commission step rules or the tariff. And I'll say that's apparent non-compliance because we can't determine officially whether it's non-compliance or not without a commission determination. What these investigations are not, they are not a formal commission proceeding. This is commission staff that has been directed to conduct these investigations. They are not appearing before a commissioner or an administrative law judge. As such, they do not follow the standard rules of commission proceedings, and they are not overseen by the commission. They also, by themselves, do not result in fines, penalties, or other binding orders on the BESP. Commission staff does not have the authority to do any of those things. So we are conducting the investigation as it's listed and described in the rules. They are restricted to the outage itself. They are not fishing expeditions for more general audits of the BESP. So, I think a couple of times we have perhaps strayed a little bit far from that in these investigations. The purpose of the investigation is to investigate the outage itself, not general policy and practice of the company. At this point, I'm going to just kind of go through what's in the rules and kind of make note of a couple of things. So each informal investigation under this paragraph will be handled as follows. It says, commission staff shall refer an informal investigation form to the BESP for written response. This actually starts with me creating the outage investigation form, which includes the basic facts as we know it at the time of the outage. And it says that this form shall include questions developed and solicited from the affected governing body or PSAP and the 911 Advisory Task Force. Now, for the task force, in this purpose, I have interpreted that to mean the outage committee, because the committee is the body created by the task force specifically to discuss outage related issues. So unless somebody tells me that they think this should go to the full task force instead, that's what I'm going to continue doing, is sending it to the outage committee. So in the past, what this means is I create the form, I send the form to the affected agencies, which is the governing body and the local PSAP or PSAPs, and I send it to the outage committee, and I say, because it says include questions developed by and solicited from, I say, if anybody has any additional questions or you have any suggested edits to the questions, I'd like to have them. And I usually give a week for that. It does not give a time frame in the rules. So that's one of the things we can talk about today, is if that 1 week time frame for turnaround is working, or if you need more time for that. The BESP shall respond in writing. So that's the first stage, is collecting that information, collecting those additional questions, if there are any, from the affected agencies and the outage committee. Then I send it to the BESP. The BESP has to respond within 30 days. I can adjust that. It says, or such lesser or greater period as commission staff may require, if such period is reasonable under the circumstances. Generally, I'm gonna stick to 30 days unless somebody has a good reason why they think it should be longer or shorter. If requested, the response shall include NOC call log entries. Generally, we have been requesting these, and copies of emails and other transcripts or recordings of phone calls between the NOC and other parties related to the outage. Generally, we have not been requesting those, but if that's something that the governing bodies or the outage committee would like us to start requesting in the future, we can. The question is, to what extent will that be useful in that particular investigation? The BESP's response shall fairly meet the substance of each request. The BESP may not provide an incomplete response citing lack of information or knowledge unless it states that it has made diligent and reasonable inquiry, and request that the commission staff allow reasonable times of extension not to exceed 14 days. This is something that I'm going to be insisting on a little bit more aggressively in future investigations, where if there is not if they don't really answer the question, if they kind of answer the question, we can push back more on that. One thing I would like to point out, though, is that the completeness of an answer to a question is sometimes subjective. And if I think that they've substantively answered a question, but the affected governing body or PSAP does not, or the outage committee does not, that's where you can ask those follow-up questions when we get to that part. So just because it doesn't raise a flag for me on how they answered a question doesn't mean that we can't continue pushing on for an answer on that type of question. Reasonable extensions of time may be granted upon request. And then down a little bit further, it says that, well, no, actually right there, it says not to exceed 14 days. So I won't give an extension longer than 14 days. It doesn't say that they can't have more than one extension if necessary. So I give them as much as 14 days unless they ask for less than that. If they need more time than that, then we can look at extension, an additional extension. Request for any extension shall be accompanied with estimates of when the information will be provided. So generally, when CenturyLink asks me for an extension, they'll say we will have these answers by X date. And that's what I put on the outage investigation form when I note the extension. Commission staff, the affected governing body or PSAP or the 911 Advisory Task Force, again, meaning the outage committee, may also request a meeting with the BESP. Something I've also been allowing here is, instead of a meeting, if people just want to ask additional follow-up questions, I've allowed that, because I don't think anybody would object to that if that's what everybody wants. If people do want a meeting, they can, but if they would rather just ask additional follow-up questions, that is also an option. Just because it's more efficient than necessarily having to wait and schedule a meeting. The BESP, if they do have a meeting, the BESP should arrange for appropriate staff to participate in the meeting, including technical support, service, and management with relevant knowledge and sufficient level of authority or supervision. I don't know what CenturyLink needs from its own staff to be able to participate in those meetings. I have noticed that in recent meetings, they have been bringing more people from CenturyLink side to those meetings, so I'm glad to see that. But that is one of the requirements. One thing I will say on the initial questions and on the follow-up questions, I've had some back and forth regarding who is able to submit questions. And what it actually says in the rules is that on the initial questions, this form shall include questions developed by and solicited from the affected governing body or PSAP and the 911 Advisory Task Force, which, like I said earlier, I'm interpreting as the Outage Committee. I have received questions from the past from individual members of the Outage Committee, and I have included those. Going forward, I'm going to ask that questions be submitted through the Outage Committee chair and submitted as a submission from the Outage Committee itself. That is so that I'm getting one set of questions from the Outage Committee. They're not going to overlap because they're maybe duplicative or even conflicting questions from different members of the Outage Committee, and that they have been thought about by the committee as a whole before submitting them for inclusion. That also goes for the follow-up questions. At times, I have allowed for individual members to submit follow-up questions. In the future, I will ask that they be submitted through the Outage Committee. Now, initial questions and follow-up questions from the affected agencies, I will always take, because that's what it says to do in here. So I will always take those directly from the affected agencies. But if you're not an affected agency and you're just a member of the Outage Committee, I'll ask that you submit those through the Outage Committee so that they come in as one coherent document. During the pendency of the informal investigation, communication shall be in writing, copied to the BESP, commission staff, affected governing body, or PSAP. It says commission staff shall maintain a complete file. I do maintain all of that internally, including all communication and recordings. Access to and use of this file is subject to applicable commission rules regarding information claimed to be confidential or highly confidential. So I do maintain all of that. I'm not at liberty to share any of it unless it is something that we're talking about during a Outage Committee investigation meeting or similar meeting of that sort. Commission staff will document in a report the closure of each informal investigation within 60 days of the outage or such greater period as commission staff may require if such period is reasonable under the circumstance of the informal investigation. Those of you who were part of the rulemaking workshops that resulted in this new 2143K rule may recall that one of the reasons that we wanted to create this process was that the Outage Committee itself was doing informal investigations previously. They were completely voluntary on the part of CenturyLink because the Outage Committee itself didn't have any formal authority to request or require CenturyLink to comply. So it was completely voluntary, and there were no real timelines around it. So they could go on for months and months and months. So part of the reasoning behind creating this rule was to create a process that would be more efficient and conclude these in a more reasonable time frame. Now, I do have to say that we are not meeting 60 days in most cases, just the 30 days of time that CenturyLink has to reply. And if they ask for a 2-week extension, that's 45 days. And then, the week that we have to give everyone to provide us with questions at the beginning. So it takes some time, and we're concluding most of them probably in around 90 days or even longer. But the idea being here that we want to keep these tight in terms of turnaround and have them closed in a reasonable amount of time. That being said, if there are follow-up questions from the agencies, the affected agencies, if there is a request for meeting from the affected agencies, or requests for, or from the Outage Committee, either of those things, follow-up questions or ongoing meeting requests, this will stay open until that's done. And it doesn't say how many meetings there can be. It doesn't limit the number of meetings. It doesn't and by extension, because I'm allowing the follow-up questions in lieu of the meetings, it doesn't say how many rounds of follow-up questions there can be. So these will stay open until there are no more follow-up questions or requests for meetings. At that time, the report that the commission staff provides includes whether or not the outage was a basic emergency service outage, whether the BESP handled the BES outage in a timely manner and with appropriate personnel, whether the BESP has committed to taking corrective action or prevent or mitigate a similar outage from occurring in the future, specifying the corrective action and time frame, if applicable. The report shall also include document any non-compliance, and again, I should say apparent non-compliance with commission rules or BESP's tariff, including BESP's service quality plan. Additionally, I have also included a section where I include other recommendations or findings. So this can include, best practices that maybe came out of discussions or meetings, or just apparent from the responses from the BESP to the outage investigation. This can be things like, I'm trying to remember a recent example, but for instance, we've had a couple of different outages where CenturyLink didn't think that maintenance was going to cause an outage because they had an alternate path, but the alternate path was not properly groomed to hold traffic or carry traffic. So there was a recommendation, an obvious recommendation there would be audit your circuits to make sure that they are properly groomed and configured to carry traffic in the event that a primary path is down. So that is an example of a best practice or recommendation that we can include. Again, it is a best practice or recommendation. It is not an order. Commission staff does not have that authority to order anything of a company. But it is something that we strongly suggest that be looked into to avoid future outages. At any time, the commission staff, the 911 Advisory Task Force, the affected governing body, or PSAP may commence a proceeding before the commission, at which time the informal investigation process shall terminate if not yet closed, other than commission staff's preparation of the report. So this is an important point. These investigations do not preclude any other formal action. The investigations themselves are not an action of the commission. They are an action of commission staff as ordered by rules, but they are not an action of the commission itself. The commissioners can take action based on the findings of the investigation if they believe it is appropriate. More importantly, though, it does not preclude affected agencies from filing a formal complaint. Where the commission may take action on its own, it is most appropriate when the BESP has failed to take action that is an obligation to the commission itself. And an example of that is filing outage reports. To that end, we are currently preparing a notice proposed rulemaking, which I think most of you are aware of, to make the outage reporting rules clearer and more easily enforceable. And as such, as kind of a side note, I did get a question in one of the comments to the pre-NOPR draft that has been distributed already, why we're not making any changes to 2143K. And I would suggest that if you have suggestions for how to improve 2143K and the informal investigation process, that this rulemaking would be a good opportunity for you to lay that out in your comments as to what you think needs to be changed or how it could be improved. Where the commission is not likely to take action on its own is when the obligation that has not been met is to a governing body rather than the commission itself. This is where formal complaints come in, because the commission taking an action on behalf of an entity that has not formally said to the commission that it has been aggrieved would be very unusual. One way to put it is that, in some cases, the Public Utilities Commission is like the police. We can enforce laws when we see them being broken, but sometimes we're the court, where we are the forum where it is discussed between a complainant and a respondent to determine whether or not a rule has been broken. We can't encourage agencies to file formal complaints, but it is always an option that is open to you. And I will point out that no formal complaints have been filed against CenturyLink by a governing body since 2016. So where we receive, informal complaints, or people will complain to us occasionally about something that the BESP has done or not done, in order for the commission to really act on those, in most cases, it's going to need a formal complaint or something along the lines of that to create a formal proceeding in which there is a record of what rules or statute or tariff provisions or commission decision have allegedly been broken. And then it is treated like a court case, where we are not taking the position of one side or the other, but we are actually looking at the evidence and making a determination based on where the evidence falls. Filing a formal complaint means filing a document through the commission's e-filing system that names your agency as the complainant and the company as the respondent, and then lists what you believe the company did that is in violation, or did not do, I should say, that is in violation of statute, rules, the tariff, or other commission decisions, and what you think should be done about it, what your remedy is. This could mean providing a billing credit. This could mean a fine against the company to encourage compliance in the future, or it could mean that, asking the commission to compel the company to do something or take some action that is within the commission's authority and jurisdiction. After it is filed, the commission will require a response from the company, and unless it's resolved, the complaint will be scheduled for a hearing. It is recommended that you have an attorney represent you, but it is not required. A lot of times, formal complaints in the past have not reached the point of an actual hearing. So it may be one of those things where you file the formal complaint, and if it goes to a hearing, you might want to get counsel involved if you can't, if that makes more sense for you. But otherwise, it is recommended that you have an attorney represent you in the formal complaint proceeding. If at any time a governing body wishes to file a formal complaint but isn't sure where to start, please reach out to Jennifer, and she can help you. Until fairly recently, we have only had one 911 staff member really at the commission, that being myself, which makes it difficult for adjudicated proceedings like this. But now that we have two 911 subject matter experts at the commission, we can break into trial staff and advisory staff, because like I said, we do treat it like a court case. It is a quasi-judicial forum, or excuse me, quasi-judicial, that's the word I'm looking for, where one person from commission staff can act as a party and engage with the other parties and attend meetings and really understand the issues behind what's happening. And the other one advises the commissioners, who are only allowed to make decisions based on what is formally in the proceeding itself. And that person is called advisory staff, and they have to keep separate, just like a court case where the judge can't go out and talk to people outside of the court proceeding or outside of the official court documents and make decisions based off of their own personal observations. So the main thing I wanted to bring to you guys today was the information about the participation of the outage committee in these investigations going forward. And that I will be requiring that additional questions or requests for meetings come through the outage committee itself as a request from the outage committee, and suggest that if we need to look at if there needs to be a process around that, the outage committee is entirely allowed to come up with their own internal processes for how they want to do that. I'm thinking maybe when I send out the request for additional questions or requests for meetings, that it just be an automatic understanding that those need to go to Tina Powell, which is something that I've been putting in my emails recently, is asking you to coordinate through Tina. If Tina does receive some draft questions or a draft response to a closed report, maybe there needs to be a process set up where that's shared with the rest of the committee so that the rest of the committee can provide input and feedback on those draft questions or that draft response. Whatever I get from the outage committee is what I'm going to include as far as a response to the closed outage. As far as questions go, like I said earlier, the purpose of the outage investigation is to investigate the outage itself, not to go off into looking at other general business and operational practices of the company. So I do reserve the right to make sure that any questions that are included in the outage investigation form are specific to that outage investigation. Other than that, though, you guys are free to come up with your own process for how you want that to happen. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the response to the closed investigation, there is a time frame set in the rules for that. It is 14 days. So when staff comes up with its final conclusions for an outage investigation and provides a copy of that to the outage committee and the affected agencies and the BESP itself, for that matter, have 14 days to provide a response if they want to. It is optional. They do not have to provide a response. As far as follow-up questions or requests for meetings, the rules are silent on how long you have to do that. Typically, I've given a week for that. But if you guys think that you need more time or want more, then I'm open to that option as well. Kimberly.
Daryl, I apologize if I'm not tracking. I just have a follow-up question around how outage questions need to be not pertaining to the operations of the business. So, for example, if we have an issue with an outage and we have an issue with the way the business Lumen responded to the outage, or the number of personnel that was available to respond, or how the personnel was unprofessional, lack of response to conversations during the outage, are you indicating those are not included as part of it? Or is that in that envelope for that one particular outage and can be and should be discussed and considered?
No, I would say if they're related, if you can relate those questions to that particular outage, then yes, they can and should be included. I'll give you an example. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but I did receive some questions recently that asked for all job descriptions of all technicians in the company and copies of all training that those job technicians went through regarding particular types of outages in general. And that's where I'm saying that it appears to me that we're looking more for an audit of the company's operations and practices rather than information about that outage. So if you ask those questions, I think those are perfectly valid questions to ask, but you try to frame them in a way where you're getting at that particular outage, because these are each an investigation of an outage, or maybe a series of outages that have been added in a joint investigation.
Yeah, and that question could have been part of one of ours. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but
I've gotten a couple like that, so
yeah,
sure.
it could be because specifically, not to go into all the details about the Jackson outage, but when we start talking about personnel and ability to respond and their skills and their training, this group knows from a committee perspective, and those of us even on this committee that have experienced outages, some of the hardships come with who's available, who's responding, who can touch whose equipment, some things that were not disclosed. Okay, how many people do we have now that if Entrado has to roll a truck to touch their equipment that are able to respond from the Longmont office to do that? So some of those pieces probably do go into the organizational structure of the 911 provider and then their contracts, right? Because it's Lumen and it's that dotted line to Entrado, which then if that dotted line to Entrado that's the team supporting the equipment, and in the outages, Lumen is passing that to Entrado and putting that monkey on their back, then our questions are going to kind of trickle down that way to say, okay, well then, hey, Lumen, in that contract with Entrado, should we be expecting a truck roll and somebody at Entrado that can go on site to support this equipment?
Yeah, and
that's all okay in your eyes? That's fine for us to ask those questions. Or is that too organizational?
Just on the surface of how you just asked it just now, I think those questions are fine. They're about that outage and what could have been done different regarding that outage. So the other thing I will say is, if in doubt, include the question, and that way I can look at it. And if it looks like, it really doesn't have anything to do with that particular outage, it's more about company operations in general, I might not include it in the form. But what I would say is, if you are asking questions that are getting into those kinds of things, try to relate it back to this particular outage. And I think the way you just described it, you have.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yep. Joe?
I believe I've asked some questions of that sort, but I've also suggested that it'd be helpful if we could have Lumen do a presentation as to its overall maintenance and support for the ESINet and 911 related services, for the training that its technicians have, just a general overall, so we have an understanding of what they say they are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there might be rules that the PUC might want to craft if it sees that there are areas of oversight. Aside from that, do I understand that informal complaints, are they now subsumed by the informal investigations? An authority can't file an informal complaint?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Can you restate it?
Yeah, the way I understood the rules, and it's still an authority that's aggrieved by an outage can file an informal complaint, which requires that the carrier respond with a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essentially to allow the parties to engage about a resolution without getting the commission involved in a proceeding.
Right.
But that's the next step if the party, if the party isn't satisfied, the complainant isn't satisfied. And here you were talking about that if a party isn't satisfied, or a party can file a formal complaint, and then this process will stop. And if they're not satisfied with the resolution, they can file an informal complaint. So I just wanted to understand, are the informal complaints still permitted in your view?
Informal complaints are still permitted, and you can also request mediation. I've only known of one governing body in the entire time I've worked at the commission that requested mediation on a matter with CenturyLink. That's kind of an interesting process. Commission staff isn't even involved in informal mediations. From what I understand, they had signed an administrative law judge basically to act as sort of a middle person to organize a discussion. And there is a mediation process spelled out in the tariff as well. However, you don't have to go through all of that before you get to a formal complaint. If you feel like a rules have been violated, if you feel like statute has been violated, or provisions of the tariff have been violated, you can file a formal complaint at any time. With these informal investigations, if a formal complaint is filed, the investigation will stop if it's still going on, essentially to allow the formal complaint to play out. Otherwise, whether or not there was an investigation of an outage, if you're filing a formal complaint about an outage, the investigation does not hinder or impede that process. Does that help?
It does. And the other question I had is if we submit questions at the different stages, and they're submitted to the outage committee, does the outage committee have to meet with them, and does that affect the timing of when everything happens?
You're asking if you submit questions, what happens after that?
So typically I've been submitting questions to you. I understand in most cases I've been the only one submitting them. if I'm now submitting to the outage committee, are they just then getting passed to you? So it's just a more formal thing, or is the outage committee then meeting and going through a process to say, gee, these couple of questions from different parties are kind of similar?
Yeah.
Why don't we make them the same?
So the outage committee can run itself how it wants. What I'm suggesting is that maybe if somebody submits additional questions or follow-up questions to Tina, what could happen is a copy of those goes out to the rest of the outage committee and says, here's some draft follow-up questions. Does anybody have any input on these? Maybe nobody will have any input and they'll get submitted just as how they originally sent to Tina. But it will give the rest of the outage committee an opportunity to say, oh, you know what, that makes me think about this question, or that makes me think we need additional information on this topic. Or maybe I see what you're getting at with this question, but maybe it should be worded better this way. And that might take more time, which is why I'm saying the statute, or the rules don't give a time frame on the turnaround for those additional questions or follow-up questions. So the week that I've been giving might not be enough. If you guys want more time, we can do that. Maybe we start with a week, and if nobody submits any questions, then a week is enough. But if somebody does submit questions and there needs to be a little bit back and forth in the outage committee before they're submitted to me, we could extend that. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today, was how the outage committee wanted to engage in this process.
And Daryl, that is what I've been doing. Joe, you're
Okay.
right. You're the only one that I've gotten anything from. But I send it out to the committee. I wait a week and let anybody provide any feedback, and then I send those on to Daryl. I think Joe, yours were statements, but I think questions would operate the same. I would send it out to the committee, wait a full week for anybody to contact me, whether they had any changes or anything they wanted to add, and then forward those to Daryl. I'm totally open to do it any other way. That's just what I've been doing so far.
And Tina, this is, Joe in the past has also submitted questions directly to me. And so that may be why you haven't seen those, to know that they need to go out to the rest of the committee. So that's what I'm asking for today, is that it be done as a committee instead of from individual members.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Cool.
Okay. The other thing I'd notice, it seems like in the last week there are a whole bunch of outage items. I don't know if they're all new or not, because I was out of town part of the week. But when there are a bunch of them all at once, it's definitely going to take longer to get to them. And so there should be more time allowed.
That's fair. They tend to get done when I have the time to do them. And sometimes that means that I end up doing them in a batch. So that it does make sense that it would take more time to get them to respond to them. So I get that. Maybe if I'm doing more than a couple at a time, I give 2 weeks for additional questions instead of just one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and Daryl, I can also put a step in there just to let you know if I do get questions and that we will need more time.
Yeah.
That way you're just not waiting. But that way, if we have something, you can hold it open a little bit longer.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Joe?
I was going to say there's a recent case where Tim brought some staff to a meeting to provide better response to questions. And I think that rule that addresses that we adopted specific because we had the issue where with the previous informal investigations, we'd ask Tim, he wouldn't know, he'd go back to his staff, he'd come back, we'd have a follow-up question, he wouldn't know, we'd have to go back to staff to find out.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a lot more efficient to have them. The recent meeting I'm referring to was where his staff wasn't prepared,
Mm-hmm.
and your Jennifer terminated the meeting because they weren't prepared. I thought that was the right thing to do, but we
Right.
need to make sure that they are prepared. And I don't know if we need to add something to the rules saying that they shall be prepared, but
Well, it does.
it's a really bad showing.
Yeah, I think it probably when we wrote the rules, it was considered assumed that they would be prepared for the meeting. They did come prepared to the next meeting though, so at least that's a step in the right direction. But it will also be noted on the outage committee or in the outage report that they were not prepared for the first meeting. Joe?
There's another issue that I've raised, and that is my concern that there was one case that involved Thornton where the Lumen final response said, oh, and there could have been another cause. It could have been a power outage, which I think would be a serious issue if there isn't backup power support for the SINet, but there was an answer to ask questions because that was at the end. There's times where they've said we've not yet determined whether or not we're going to give a bill credit, and the proceedings or the investigation's been terminated or closed. And there was one, it might have been the same one where they were trying to figure out or looking at whether or not an alternative route could be groomed to provide path diversity, and the investigation was closed before they got back with that answer. And I think it's more important that we get definitive answers from Lumen to those types of questions than we get the proceeding closed on schedule. And I think if we need to, we should change the rules to make it so that we do that, so that we get firm, clear responses from them before we close the investigations. And if there are a bunch of investigations are hanging open because they haven't been responsive or definitive in their responses, that's on Lumen. That's not on anybody else.
Well, it may be on Lumen and not on anybody else, but it also doesn't serve us either, really, to have outage investigations open with no definitive answers to them. And that was one of the issues that we had with the previous process before it was put in the rules, when it was just the outage committee doing voluntary and formal investigations, is that they would sit open. We still have one open, for example, from September of last year, from before this, when this rule went into place. So the goal here was to come to some conclusions and have something documented in a miscellaneous proceeding, which is where these get filed when they're done, so that if there needs to be some action in the future, there's some documentation of that discussion and of what CenturyLink said. I get your frustration, but what I'm looking at when I'm determining whether or not I can close an outage investigation are those specific questions that it says that commission staff has to cover in the final report. You are, however, fully free to include a response to the final report saying that you didn't think it needed to be closed or shouldn't have been closed, or would still like to see an answer on X, Y, or Z. But what I would also suggest is that if you don't believe you've gotten the answers yet that you should have gotten, then that's when those follow-up questions or requests for meetings can come in. And we can do as many rounds of those as we need until both the outage committee and the affected agencies are satisfied with the responses that they've gotten. And that's where it'll stay open as long as it needs to stay open. So that's where I would suggest, if you don't feel like the responses that you have received are complete enough, let us know with follow-up questions or requests for meetings.
Well, if the rules don't require, definitive answers to whether they're going to give bill credits, as to what the cause was, as to whether they can and will implement an alternative call path or thing, then those should be the kind of things that are required. If they didn't supply them, they're in violation of the rules, and that would be a basis of an enforcement action, rather than just close the proceeding without having answers.
And if you feel like there's wording you could provide to improve this process, I think that NOPR's a perfect opportunity for you to provide that. And the commission will consider it. It'll likely be going to an ALJ, so the ALJ will consider it. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. I don't know, Tina, if you had anything else you wanted to talk about today. My main purpose today was to kind of go over what's actually in the rules on the outage investigations and to talk about process for the outage committee participating in those going forward. And I do appreciate everyone's time and your participation.
Thanks, Daryl. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
You too.